Hi, my name's Raj Khepar, and today I'm going to be taking you through the Canon EOS R6 Mark II, which is probably my favourite camera in the R system range at the moment, and it hits a real nice sweet spot between performance and value. You can shoot 40 frames per second, you've got raw burst mode which allows you to shoot in 30 frames per second, but even go back in time and capture the preceding half a second of images. You've got really great video quality and performance as well. So you can shoot slow-mo video, 4K 60p, and even do some ProRes RAW video out of the HDMI to an external monitor. And it improves significantly on the Mark I by giving you better efficiency, so you don't run out of battery as quickly. It's about 50% better battery life out of the same battery. The autofocus has been improved, and there's a bit of a change there in terms of how you set up the autofocus, so I'll go through that a little bit as well. And there's also improvements in the type of subject matter that it can focus on. So we've added horses to it, so you can it'll recognize horses as well as zebras, and it'll also recognize aircraft and trains, as well as the ones that were already existing in the range, which are people and the eyes of people, animals like birds, cats and dogs, and it will pick out the eye of those even in flight, and motorsports. So we've sort of added a little bit more flexibility with the motorbikes. It will pick out road bikes, and it'll actually pick out the driver or rider of those cars as well if you want it to. So we'll go through a lot of the settings in the menus. So I'm going to do a full menu walkthrough of the camera, but I'm also going to show and give a little few tips on setup that I like in there, and we'll go through the hardware side. So we'll start with the hardware. I'll take you through all of the features of the camera physically, and then we'll delve into the menus, and I'll take you through everything there is to know about the R6 Mark II. So grab yourself a cup of tea, settle in, and let's get cracking. So on the hardware side, we've got a weather-sealed magnesium alloy body, and it has quite a lot of stuff going on. If you are familiar with the Mark I of this, you'll notice that the on-off switch has moved from the left-hand side at the top to just by the scroll wheel on the right-hand side, which does make it easier for one-handed operation to turn the camera on and get shooting. It also means that we have a dedicated video and still switch over on this side, which is advantageous because it was on the Mark I not possible to use the custom modes C1 and 2 and 3 in video mode, whereas now you can switch to video and save your custom modes there. We'll get to that a little bit later on. So the dedicated video on-off switch is there. We have the on-off switch here with a lock in the middle. So the lock there is customizable and will enable you to lock the scroll wheels. Not physically, but it basically stops them affecting the exposure so you don't knock it. You can customize this, you can have it turn off the touchscreen and other wheels as well if you like. Then we have the mode dial, and we'll go through each of those modes in a little while. We have the record button, so it will record in stills mode, it will just switch to video, but if you're in video mode it will give you a little bit more options in terms of flexibility of changing settings. We have a manual function button. This is a very customizable button that brings up useful settings to change on the fly when you need to quickly. We have a scroll wheel at the front here. We have a scroll wheel at the back here, which is for your thumb. Shutter button, obviously. And on the back here, we have another wheel. So we have a wheel here. Let me just turn the camera off. We also have a joystick, which allows you to move the focusing point nice and easily and quickly, and we have the AF on button, so that's for back button focusing. Next to that we have the star button, which is the exposure lock button. That is again a very customizable button, and I do recommend you have a look at the customizations because it's quite a useful button to change, as a lot of people don't use exposure lock that much anymore. Next to that we have the focus control button, so that basically allows you quick access to change the focus groupings. Again, if you don't regularly use that, you could customize that to do something else as well. So on the back here we have a magnify button. very useful button to check that you are absolutely in focus on the subject. And there's a little tip there as well, which I'll get to in the menu, which makes that an even quicker and useful button. Info, so that when you tap that, when you're on, the camera's on and you're shooting, it will cycle through different pages of information for your reference, like histograms or like a digital spirit level and things like that. The Q button here, that brings up the quick menu, and that will allow you to very quickly change all your key settings. So that has the quickest access to all of that. We have the scroll wheel here for changing settings, and then the set button in the middle, which is the sort of confirm button. Below that we have the play button, when you need to play back your images and you want to have a look at what you've shot, that is there, and then the delete button next to that. Don't get those confused, but it will give you a little pop-up to confirm whether you want to delete your images. Up on the other side, up here, we have a rate button and a menu button. So the menu button obviously takes you to the full menu, not the quick menu, and that is something we will dive into in a little while. But the rate button allows you a very quick method to add a star symbol or a star rating to your images in playback, which can make it a bit quicker when you bring your computers onto the computer and you're trying to find an image that you remember liking. You can rate it there, and then that will be embedded in the metadata of the image, and you can actually see it on your computer. And on this side we have the card slot opening. So we have dual UHS-II SD card slots here. So high-speed UHS-II cards can go in here, and it will take advantage of that speed. And you do really need high-speed cards if you want to take advantage of the 40 frames per second or the raw burst mode, because the camera's producing a lot of data very, very quickly, and you need to write that data to the card as quickly as possible so that it can relieve pressure on the buffer so you can shoot for longer. Over on the other side, we have a number of ports. So we have a USB-C port, and the camera can actually be charged via this. You can pull the images from the camera via this. We can also use this to use the camera as a webcam. So it's a plug-and-play webcam. And below that we have a HDMI out. One other thing with the USB-C port, actually, you can charge the camera while you're shooting. So if you're doing video, you can essentially power it via mains just using the USB-C. It needs to be a power delivery, PD certified. I think it's above 40 watts, 45 watts. Not exactly sure on the wattage, but it needs to be a high output power delivery system for it to work. And that will allow you to shoot for as long as you like, provided you've got enough memory storage. The other advantage to that is that you can charge it when you're out and about on the go. So I often take a power pack with me and just plug it in when I'm in the car and traveling to the next location and things like that. HDMI out, so that's micro HDMI out, that I will be using in a moment to connect my R6 to my laptop, which is I'm using via a capture card, so I can show you the menus as I go through them. That will allow you to record video externally. As I say, with the ProRes RAW, you can actually record a higher amount of data to an external recorder using that. But also you can connect it up to a TV to show people footage you've shot and things like that as well. On the other row of ports, we have a microphone and a headphone port. The microphone obviously is a 3.5mm jack that allows you to capture better quality audio than the onboard mic. And a headphone jack that will allow you to monitor that audio. Below that we have a shutter release port. So that one there, useful thing for when you're doing long exposures and you don't want to jog the camera or anything like that. You can plug in a remote shutter release. It's also quite useful for when you're using the raw burst mode to use the shutter release. It's a bit more comfortable. So if you have the camera set up pointed at a perch, for example, and you're expecting birds to get there, you can be half pressing the shutter button on that remote release cable much easier than you would be able to just hold on the camera without jogging the camera at all. That's quite useful. On the front, just here, which is a little bit hard to see, we have a depth of field preview button but this is a very customizable button. Not a lot of people use depth of field preview too much anymore, but you could customize that to be something more useful, which is what I do. And if you want to take the lens off, you've got a catch on this side of the body. Hold that down, twist the lens, take it off, and put it back on. On the very top, one thing I haven't mentioned is the hot shoe. So the hot shoe is the new style multi-function shoe. The multi-function shoe adds a row of pins right at the front, and that allows you a whole new range of accessories. So accessories that are powered by the camera, they don't have internal batteries, and communications happen all the way through just this port. So microphones can go plug straight onto that, and it can just pull the information from that microphone straight through. You don't have to plug a cable into the side of the camera, and it's powered by the camera as well. The other things we do is a replacement to the ST3 flash transmitter. I think it's the ST10, which is a very small one that just plugs straight onto that and doesn't need any AA batteries, which is really, really great. The normal hot shoe is also there. So you've got the normal pins for using any of your current flash accessories. So both older flashes and newer flashes are compatible with this camera. What you might find is with some of the newest Canon ones, that have the weather sealed ring and they don't have the multifunction shoe, is that they're a bit of a squeeze to get on. You can either take the rubber seal off the bottom of your flash and it'll fit on perfectly fine, or you can get the ADE1 adapter, which will allow you to fit them fully weather sealed onto this camera. Okay, on the bottom of the camera, final bit, we have the standard thread for the tripods or other accessories, and same size 1/4 inch thread that you get on any other camera. We can put a battery grip on this camera, so there is an optional accessory battery grip, which is the same one as the Mark 1, actually, the R6 Mark 1. And then we have the battery compartment. So in here we have an LPE6, that's one of my ones, but it would come with an LPE6NH, which is the newest format of that battery. And though they are higher capacity than sort of some of the older LPE6s, and they allow the camera to shoot at sort of the higher frame rates in mechanical shutter than you would on some of the older batteries, and it allows the camera to be charged while you're using it as well. Last couple of things with the hardware: you have a fully articulated screen, so we can flip that around, turn it over. You can shoot low down easier and higher up easier because it flips either way. And then we have a really high quality viewfinder. So the viewfinder is fully electronic and keeps up with fast moving subjects really, really well. If it isn't sharp out the box because it's, comes as a factory setting, what I recommend doing is having a look through the viewfinder, look at the text, and then adjust this little wheel on the side of the viewfinder. This little wheel is called your diopter, and the diopter will ensure that the lens in the viewfinder is sharp. And then once that's sharp, what you see through the viewfinder is what you're going to get. That's all the hardware side. Let's get cracking with the software side. Okay, to show you the menus, I've got my camera hooked up to a HDMI lead, and that's going through a capture card to my laptop, which is down here. So I'm going to be looking down here to see what the menus are showing me, because it won't show on the back screen when it's connected like this. It does mean that you will be treated to some views of a fairly empty corner of my living room, which has the cameras pointed at me. Lucky you. Now, I am going to show you the mode dial first. So all the things that we get on the mode dial. We have a whole load of options here. We have A+, which is the fully automatic mode. Now, in this mode, you basically don't get a lot of options to override any settings. The camera does all of the work. It's very good at scene recognition, so it will recognize if you're doing portraits and it will pick out the person. And the focusing system looks at every part of the image and just tries to find something in it. If you want a bit more flexibility and a little bit more control over the camera, a different option for automatic would be for P, which is program auto. That allows you more control to override some of the focus settings while the camera takes control and care of the exposure settings. Next to this we have hybrid auto. So when we go into hybrid auto, we can create video and still. So every time you take a picture, it will record about a second's worth of video. I can't remember exactly how long, but it's a little tiny clip. And it's a really lovely way of photographing sort of trips out and days out, or Christmas time. Christmas time is the time I accidentally discovered this one. And it's a really lovely thing to have on the end of your trip, because you have a whole compiled load of videos that just is a lovely highlight reel of your holiday. Next one is scene selection, so we can actually pick out different scenes. So we've got portrait, we've got group photos, landscape, panoramic shot, sports, kids, panning, close-up, food, night portrait, handheld night scene, and HDR backlight control, and fully silent shutter. Now, if you're in one of the other modes, you can go into fully silent shutter in a different way. You can set that up manually as well. A lot of these are basically just telling the camera that that's the type of subject matter you're shooting, and it will pick the correct settings for you. Panning actually is quite clever. It will reduce the shutter speed, but it also uses the image stabilisation system to help keep the subject in the right place. And the handheld night scene is quite clever as well, so it will actually take multiple pictures and combine those to give you a cleaner and better image at night time. There's a few other options in here. I won't go into every single one, but it's a great thing to have a little play around with. The next setting we have is creative filters. So in this we can choose different filters to apply to the images. You know, they're quite fun, different effects, if you like. So it's worth having a look in here as well. There's quite a few we can play around with. Now, going back the other way, to ignore the custom modes for a moment, we have flexible priority mode, FV. So FV is a bit like having manual, fully automatic program and AV, TV all in one. It's all wrapped in one. So you can set any of the three variables, your aperture, your ISO and your shutter speed, to automatic or manual at any point. So you could essentially have it on FV and never change the mode if you wanted to. It's a great and easy way of doing it. I personally prefer to use AV or TV or manual. I just find that the controls are a little bit more intuitive in that way. Then we have TV and we have AV. So AV and TV are your shutter priority, time value for TV, and AV is aperture value. So these are, you set your aperture or your shutter speed, and then the camera takes care of the rest of the settings. And this is really great if you want to, as the example shows here, for time value, set a slower shutter speed and get the flowing water effect with waterfall, or you want to freeze the action and you go really, really fast on the shutter speed. Equally with aperture priority, you're getting creative control over your depth of field, because you can set your aperture. So if you wanted a really shallow depth of field, you'd set a big aperture, so you'd set a low number, something like a 1.8 if you can do that with your lens, and that will give you that nice shallow depth of field. The camera takes care of the rest of the exposure, so you don't really need to worry about all of that, but you get some creative control. And I think this is a really great way to get yourself into getting more control over your imagery and how the sort of final image is going to look. The final one here is fully manual. Just to be completely clear, this doesn't set your focus into manual. This is all about exposure only. With fully manual, you are taking control over your shutter speed and your aperture. Your ISO can be on automatic or in set value with ISO. But this allows you the most control over all of your settings. Now, this isn't necessarily the best way of doing it if you're working in a very quickly changing environment. Where you use aperture, manual or TV will very much depend on the way you shoot and the environment you're shooting in. The next one is bulb. So bulb holds the shutter open for as long as you hold the shutter button down. There is actually a bulb timer in the menu, which we'll get into, which allows you to do that without actually physically having to hold the button down. In manual mode, the longest shutter speed you can go to is 30 seconds. Anything longer than that, you'll need to go to bulb mode to do. And the ones we ignore, so C1, C2 and C3. Now currently they're all set to program because I haven't customized these. But what you can do is set all of your settings up in the way you want. So you can set your focusing in a certain way, you can set your what type of mode you're in terms of manual, AV or TV. All of these different settings you can change, your white balance, everything. And you can save that to one of the custom modes. By saving it then, you can very quickly change the type of photography you're doing. So you might have one for sports and wildlife where you've got the frame rates on really high and you're on TV with a fast shutter speed and all of this sort of stuff. And then you might have one for landscape, which will be very, very different. The other way to use it is for wedding photographers, for example, which I imagine a lot of wedding photographers would like this camera, is to set up your exposures and your settings for different areas of the wedding at different points in the day. So you'd go into the inside part of the venue, you'd set your settings for that, save it as custom 1, and you go to the outside and save it as sort of custom 2. And that way you can very quickly change your settings to the right area. It won't necessarily be exactly right, but at least gives you the right kind of ballpark. We'll get onto the customize a little bit more when we encounter them in the full menu. The next thing I'm going to show you is the Q menu. So what we have on the back of the camera is the Q button that I mentioned. So we can tap Q. I'm going to go back to manual. I can tap Q and it shows me a load of options for things I need to get to quite quickly. So the first one we hear is the autofocus. We're going to potentially regularly need to change the autofocus settings. So I can go from spot AF, which is a very small single point, to a much larger group, and I can set these up, customize these. So if I can go in here and actually customize the size of these, I can make it narrower or taller. And I did that by pressing the set button. Just below it where it says set, it says info to enable. When it says enable, it's actually already enabled, but this is the tracking. So what this is allowing us to do is pick a subject and track that subject from there. If you're used to the EOS R6 Mark 1 or the R5, cameras like that, we had in this menu a dedicated face tracking mode. You don't have this on this one. You have any of these can do the face tracking, which is a lot more flexible and a lot more intuitive. So I can pick this one, I can say do the tracking, so I can pick a subject and it will track that subject from that point. I apologise if you can hear my belly rumbling. Right, if I have the, if I press info here and disable that, it will not track. It will just focus on whatever's in those points. A lot more like how a digital SLR tends to work. For most subjects, I think you're kind of getting the best out of the camera by enabling the tracking, because it has a lot of the focus recognition stuff, and that's what you're getting with this focusing system. It really enables you to not really worry about whether the subject's where you expect it to be necessarily, but just making sure you can get the frame. So below that we have the focus modes, so we can have one shot, AI focus, or servo. So one shot, you half press the shutter button, it'll lock focus and bleep. With servo, it'll continue focusing for as long as you're half pressing the button. And then AI focus, it will do a hybrid between the two and try and basically work out what it is you're focusing on and decide which one you want to use there. Below that we have the image quality, so we can set RAW. So by pressing set we can choose any of the RAW settings, either not to do it, or full RAW, or C RAW, which is a compressed RAW, which basically halves the size, or nearly halves the size of the file size of those images. It doesn't reduce the resolution, but it does just kind of compress it a little bit. It will still offer you some of the flexibility in editing, but not quite as much as your full RAW would. And then we can also set our JPEG quality here as well. So, and you can shoot RAW and JPEG. You can actually set them to go to different cards, but that's in the full menu. Below that we have drive mode. We can set single shot, so when you hold the shutter button down, it just takes one picture and doesn't do any more. Or high speed continuous plus, which is really, really fast. I think it's 40 frames per second if you're in electronic shutter mode. High speed, and then your low speed, self-timer 2, and then custom continuous one at self-timer. So it does a number of images at the end of 10 seconds. Below that we have the metering mode, so we have this is how much of the frame the camera takes into account when it's trying to decide the exposure. We can sort of customize that here. And below that we have the anti-flicker, so on the other side, sorry. Anti-flicker shoot. Now having this enabled is really, really beneficial in terms of being inside. So if you're shooting outdoor sports or you know, an event or something like that, this will take into account the flicker, the wave of the lights. So all internal lighting, artificial lighting, has a sort of flicker, or nearly all. Some are better than others. And what this will do is enable the camera to automatically detect that, and it will take a picture at the peak, at the top of that wave every single time, which allows you consistency. It does mean you won't necessarily get the full speed of the camera, but it will enable you more consistent lighting and results. Below that we have the white balance, so we can go in here and check and change your white balance, and we can even press info here and customize it a little bit. We have lots of different modes here, so we have fully automatic white balance, and we have, if we press set here, we can set ambience priority or white priority. You'll notice the difference there. It's keeping some of the warmth in the image or not, depending on what you think it should look like. And then we can set here different areas of autofocus. We can set up custom white balance, so that's taking a picture of something and then it will set it according to that picture. And the Kelvin value, which is what I tend to use, and you can go in here and set that to, and you just sort of scroll higher or lower depending on if you want it warmer or cooler. Below that we have the picture style, so this is how the camera processes the image. So what you see on the back of the camera is essentially a processed version of the RAW, and it's applying a look to it. Now, how much of that look is affecting the image is up to you. So if you set here neutral or vivid, neutral or faithful, it's going to be quite a small amount of edit. If you have landscape or portrait, landscape's going to make the greens a bit more and blues a bit more vivid, and portrait's going to be more flat on the skin tones. What often happens if you don't bring the images into DPP, which is Canon's Digital Photo Professional Editing Suite, it will actually ignore this setting anyway. So you'll look on the back camera, it'll look really punchy. You bring it on the camera and it looks a bit flatter, and that's because it's going back to the sort of resorting back to the original RAW file. So I tend to have mine on neutral or faithful, but you could also set it to any of the others if you wanted to. Particularly if you're shooting JPEG. So if you're shooting JPEG, it will bake this into the image. So it'll be sort of saved on the image. Below that we have subject to detect. Now this is quite important for your focusing. If you are doing a bit of everything, then auto is really good. If you know what you're photographing, if you know you're photographing an animal or a person, I'd set it to that. The reason being it's quicker, and it's just able to pick out the subject from further away as well, if you set your subject. So we can go in here and set people, animals or vehicles, and then on the vehicles you see spot detection, which says enable. Spot detection is the driver, so that will pick out the helmet or the face of the driver in the vehicle or the rider. Why he's called spot, I'm not really sure, but that's what we've called it. And then below that we have cropping and aspect ratio, so you can decide to drop into a 1.6 crop if you wanted to, or set it to a square or 4:3 or 16:9. If you're shooting fully raw images, it will give you a box around the image in playback of what the crop is, but it'll give you the full image regardless. Before we go into the full menu, I just want to show you another Q screen. So the Q screen that we had was menus on both sides of the images. If we press the info button, we can actually cycle through to this screen, which is how the sort of back screen used to look on a digital SLR. So if you were familiar with that, it's exactly the same as what it was on a digital SLR, and we can tap through with the Q button and then change all of these different settings. They're mostly the same as what we had on the other Q screen, but there are a few little notable differences. So we can actually set here, we can go in here and set the record function, so how the camera deals with files to multiple cards, so whether it records to one as it fills out the other, or it records to both simultaneously so that you're getting a backup of your images, or whether it's using one for video and one for stills. It's entirely up to you. Another area that's slightly different is this. We have Wi-Fi and Bluetooth connections, so we can very quickly get to our Wi-Fi and connectivity settings. I will come back to this later on in the full menu. And what else do we have that's different? Most of these are the same. We have flash exposure compensation. So we have exposure compensation that allows us to lighten or darken an image based on the automatic exposure metering, if any of the variables are in automatic. If you're working with flash, you also might find that the flash is too bright relative to the rest of the image, so it's kind of overpowering or underpowering in some cases. So you can go in here and flash exposure compensation allows you to get brighter or darker for the flash. The other one, and my favourite place in the camera menus, is the customise camera controls. So here we can go to customise buttons and we have a suite of different options. So we can pick a button anywhere on the camera essentially, most of them are customisable, and then we can set that up to do something else as we desire. And you'll notice that we have different columns, so we have a different column for stills and video, and you can actually set them up separately. It's well worth having a look in here because I always say these cameras are out of the box really good for everybody, but they're not perfect for anyone. And by having a look in here, you will be able to set the camera up to work more efficiently for the type of photography that you do. And actually, obviously, there's a lot you can customize, and you'll find that you'll experiment with one thing for a while and then it doesn't quite work for you. But it's worth just having a look at different ways of setting it up because it can work far more efficiently for yourself. So, for example, I have set up back button focus. So on the AF on button, the AF is on, and the star button, AF is on. If I want to set it up properly, I would get rid of AF on the shutter button, so I'd set that to metering only. So now I have two back button focuses, AF on and the star button, which is exposure lock button. Because I don't ever use exposure lock, so I've set it to something else. However, at the moment it looks like both are doing exactly the same thing, but if I tap into the exposure lock button, down the bottom you can see info detail set. So if I press info, we can actually set up specific operation for that button. So instead of it being whatever the camera is set to, I've got the camera set to a larger point with focus tracking and everything on. If I want to, I can set AF area to something else, so I've set it to a single point, and I've also set the tracking off. So the ticks on the left are to confirm that you are overriding what the settings are, the sort of standard settings of the camera are, and the box on the right is what you're overriding it to. So I have one back button, the AF on button doing tracking, so I can press and track, but I might find that it's not picking out exactly what I want to. Maybe I want to pick out a logo on a person's jumper or something like that. I can then move my thumb across to the star button and I've got a single point, no tracking. It's a really quick way of changing how the focusing system behaves just by moving my thumb. I don't have to move the camera away from my eye and change the settings or anything like that. Really, really easy, nice way of working. Other customizations, let me just bring up that screen again. I sometimes do, so the depth of field preview button on the front, I will often change that. So I'm not going to go through the entire customization menu because there's so much you can do here. But useful things like register recall function, for example, I can set it to that, go back in and press info detail set, and I can set up a specific setup. So I shoot 90% of what I do in fully manual, for example, but sometimes when I'm photographing in one direction, I've got the settings right for that, something interesting is happening behind me. In that situation, the light can be very different and I don't know that I'm going to get the right shot. So I'll set my register recall function to something like program auto with, automatic ISO and all the rest of it. Everything's on automatic. That way I can turn around, hold that button down, and it changes the setting of the camera from fully manual to program auto. While I'm holding that button down, I can take a picture and I know that I'm going to get a picture. It might not be exactly the correct exposure for what I want, but it's an exposure that's roughly right. So that's how I set it up. You would be able to set it up completely differently for anything that you would find useful. The other thing I do is some cameras, and I'm not sure if how this one is set up by default, is often it used to be that multi-controllers was off by default. I have it set to direct AF point selection, so that way when you want to move the focusing point with your thumb on the joystick, it just moves it. You don't have to press another button to unlock that button, the joystick, to then move it around. Have a play and that will make sense. You can actually go info detail set here as well, so you can you can actually set up a function for when you tap the joystick as well. So the joystick is also a button, so you can set that up in here too. One thing I would make a point of is when you're doing two back button focuses, the one setting I don't recommend using very much is this one here, the eye detection autofocus. The reason being, what this does is it takes into account the entire frame and doesn't take into account where your focusing point is. So it will just look at the entire frame and find something in it. That might be useful for some areas of photography, so if that makes sense to you, then great. But if you're trying to pick out a specific person in the frame and track that person for eye focus, doing it a slightly different way makes more sense. So we can customize buttons, go to AF on, and we want to press info detail set here and set up eye detection here. This way, when you move the focusing point, it's going to go from that point rather than look at the entire frame. Right, now we'll go into the full menu. A couple of things on the menu system. When you've got the menu open and you press the Q button, it cycles through the tabs much faster. So instead of having to scroll through every single one, you can just press Q and it will go to the next section of the menu. I'm going to start in the red menu, so we're going to go with red menu 1 and image quality. So image quality we've already kind of established on the Q menu. We can set up here for JPEG and HEIF size or RAW size. HEIF I will come on to a little bit later. So the HEIF format is a more compressed but better image quality format than JPEG. It's a 10-bit image file rather than 8-bit image file, so you're getting more information. It's not widely supported at the moment, but it is an option for you should you want a slightly better image format. In order to enable HEIF, you need to enable another setting, which I'll show you later on. Dual pixel RAW, so this is different to dual pixel AF. So dual pixel AF works by having every single pixel on the sensor split into two photo sites. You have a little micro lens over the sensor, and you have two little photoreceptors underneath, rather than one, which a normal pixel would have. This allows every pixel to have a left and right eye, which allows it to focus, and allows us to focus in very low light and do all the tracking and the clever stuff that we do. Dual pixel RAW takes the information from both of those photo sites and allows you to adjust settings in post-production afterwards using Canon's Digital Photo Professional, DPP. Dual pixel RAW allows you to adjust things and give you a sort of slightly sharper image if you've missed focus slightly, so it adjusts the point of optimal sharpness. We're also able to reduce ghosting and flare and a few other things. It does mean that your image file sizes are double what they were, and it does mean that the camera won't necessarily be able to shoot at 40 frames a second. But it's a useful thing for some areas of photography. It's worth having an experiment and seeing what you think. So cropping aspect ratio below that, where we can go to 1.6 crop and 16:9. As I said, it will show you the shooting area in the viewfinder, and it's up to you whether it's just masked or it just gives you an outline of what the frame will look like afterwards. If you're shooting in JPEG, you shoot a square image, you'll only get a square image. If you shoot in RAW, it'll bring up those lines in DPP afterwards, so you can crop to exactly what you had it set to. Digital teleconverter, if you are in RAW, this will be disabled, but if you're in JPEG or in video, we also have a digital teleconverter. You can sort of crop into the image, essentially. That's what it's doing. It's crop against the image, but it's really good quality, and it means that if you're doing video and you're shooting at 1080 and you use the digital teleconverter, it gives you a lot more flexibility out of the same lens. Menu 2, exposure, compensation, and also exposure bracketing, AEB. So if I use one wheel, it'll give me exposure bracketing. I use the other, and that's it won't let me do the other because I'm in fully manual with manual ISO, so it doesn't do the exposure compensation. But exposure bracketing, it'll take a picture underexposed, middle exposure, and then overexposed, and you can combine them afterwards yourself. One thing to note is this isn't in-camera HDR. It does have that, but this isn't where that is. Next one is ISO speed settings. We can actually set the ISO speed Here, there are much quicker ways of doing that. We can just use one of the dials on the normal shooting mode, but we can limit the range. So if you know you're not going to shoot at the higher end of the ISO range, you can reduce what is possible. You can actually reduce the minimum down to 50 as well, if you wanted to. I tend to leave it as is for the most part. And down the bottom here we have minimum shutter speed for the automatic shutter speed. So if you're in aperture priority or program, it's the slowest shutter speed that the camera will go to. If you have slightly shakier hands, you might need to sort of force the camera to automatically use a slightly higher shutter speed, so you remain getting sort of sharper images, and you can do that here, so you can sort of shift that faster. You can actually set a specific shutter speed maximum as well, so entirely up to you. Next one is HDR shooting mode. So HDR PQ. If you enable this, this isn't multiple images, it's shooting in HEIF format. Now, HEIF format, as I said, is a 10-bit image file format, but it allows you to, because it's 10-bit, allow you to shoot HDR imagery. If you have a HDR enabled screen, you'll get the most out of this. If you don't, you won't really notice the difference. You will get more color information as well with a 10-bit image. You can't shoot JPEG and HEIF, but you can convert them in camera afterwards if you needed to. HDR mode, this is the multiple images HDR, so you can shoot HDR with a moving subject. This will not allow you any sort of flexibility of what the HDR does. It's very, very fast here. Or we can go into dynamic range mode, so it's giving you the sort of maximum amount of dynamic range you can. And in this way, you'd want to keep the camera very steady on a tripod, ideally. And you can have the camera save just the final resulting image, that will combine the 3 or 5, depending on how many you do. Or you can have it save all of the images, so you can do some more editing in post-production if you wanted to. Continuous HDR, whether it does it just the one time or you're doing a set of different HDR images. You can have the camera automatically align the images, so if you are hand holding and you're relatively steady, it can align things that are quite close. It does mean it's going to crop in slightly, but it does allow you to do that. And here you can set how big a shift in exposure you're getting in there. Right, I'm going to turn HDR off because it won't allow me other settings. Auto lighting optimizer, as I mentioned, if you're in manual it doesn't work, but that will allow the camera to sort of prioritize the people in your image. Highlight tone priority below that. If there's a particularly bright area, it tries to save that area, so you're not clipping any highlights. Next menu is anti-flicker shoot. So I've mentioned this in the Q menu. It sort of takes into account the wave and the flicker of artificial lighting. The high frequency anti-flicker shooting is a new thing. Now, high frequency anti-flicker shooting is all about these new LEDs that are firing and sort of flickering at a much higher frequency than the sort of ordinary lights would be. And sometimes when you're on a film set, you're working with multiple lights with lots of different flickers, so it can be a bit all over the place, and this will allow you the best way of dealing with that. So if I enable that, I can set an auto detect, I can hold the camera still, and it will run through different shutter speeds to find a flicker. Apparently I have pretty good lighting in here. Let's try this. Let's try pointing it at this lamp to see if it detects a flicker. Turns out my LED lighting is pretty good, no flicker. If you go manual settings here, you'll notice we can actually set very unusual shutter speeds. So I've got shutter speeds of 1/54.6th of a second, and you can really fine tune your shutter speeds to reduce that flicker. This will be particularly useful in video mode as well, so you can do it in there too. Let me just turn that off. Next one below is external speed light control. If we go in here and we have a flash connected, it will allow you to actually adjust the settings inside the flash. And we have the option to sort of determine what the balance is between the flash and the ambient light. And this is a fairly new setting that we introduced a while back that allows you to shift instead of using exposure compensation for each shot, you can set here that you want more of the ambient light to be the sort of the priority, and you're just trying to fill it a little bit, or you want it to be more flash based and less of the ambient light. The other thing you can do here with the newer cameras is actually prioritize the face. So it will use the metering to basically work out the best and optimal light for the face of your subject, which is really useful in a wedding environment, for example. I'm not going to go into the rest of the flash settings too much, but that's all where that is. And below that, metering mode, which I've already mentioned. So one thing to note, spot metering on this camera is the center of the image. It doesn't follow around the focusing point. That's only on the R3. Right, red menu 4. White balance, as I say, I use on Kelvin value. We've already gone through that. Custom white balance, we can actually pick an image from the memory card to set a custom white balance up. Great if you've got a great grey card. White balance shift is this thing, so we can actually shift the colours a little bit. Again, if you're shooting in RAW, it's not necessary to really do this. Colour space, sRGB or Adobe RGB. Now, if you know about colour spaces, you know that Adobe RGB is the larger of the colour spaces. It's not the largest colour space, but it is larger than sRGB. However, if you're shooting in RAW, you have all the information either way. The advantage of shooting in Adobe RGB and working in Adobe RGB is that because you're getting that bigger colour space, when you're working on the images, you can sort of edit them within that colour space and have more colours to work with, and when you print you'll see the benefits. However, the internet works in sRGB. So if you're working in Adobe RGB and export in sRGB, you are sort of leaving it up to the whim of the computer to determine what the colours look like when it brings it back down into a smaller colour space. So I tend to recommend using sRGB unless you are working for print. If you'll notice down in Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom, you can actually change the colour space that you're working in, and it will pull that data from the RAW. The RAW is the same either way. It's more information than either of these two colour spaces. So, yeah. I hope that made sense. Picture style, landscape, and all of these. You can actually set up user-defined ones as well. As I mentioned, I tend to use something like neutral or faithful for the most part. It will embed this in the JPEG, but it won't embed this in the RAW, other than in DPP. In our software will register which one you had it set to. I like faithful because it will show me the closest of on the back screen what it's going to look like on the computer. Clarity, again, this is something that you can apply in your images before you've even shot them, and you can sort of increase the micro contrast in the image. So down the bottom you can shoot creative filters even if you're in manual mode. You don't have to go to the creative filter mode to do this. You can still have control of your exposure, but use one of the sort of funky fisheye effects or other filters if you wanted to. Turn that off. Menu 5, lens aberration correction. The advantage to the R system is that the correction data for the lenses is embedded in the lens. It has it in the chip, so it is worth having these on. So I tend to recommend having digital lens optimizer on. Distortion correction, you know, you can enable that or disable that depending on your preference there. Peripheral illumination correction, I tend to have that on, and it just means that you're getting the best possible image quality from your lenses. Long exposure noise reduction. When you're doing long exposures, the sensor heats up and builds up noise. So you can turn on noise reduction for that. And then below that, high ISO noise reduction. Obviously, when you push up the sensitivity, you build up noise. In-camera noise reduction is pretty great. There are lots of stuff that does it in post-production as well now. So, you know, entirely up to you whether you use that. So dust delete data, it will actually, you can set this up to find dust spots on your sensor and then automatically delete that data. I think it does that in software rather than in camera, but it's worth reading the manual for that one. All right, menu 6, multiple exposure. This is the ability to take a picture, overlay it with another photo and take another picture, and you kind of stack images into something more interesting and artistic. you have a lot of options here for saving multiple images, all of the individual images rather, or just the final finished images. You can set a specific image from your memory card that you've already shot as your first image, and then overlay it and continue from there. And you can actually set up the type of blend that it does between the two, or the multiple images. Below that is raw burst mode. Now this is a clever thing. If we enable that, we can set up pre-shooting. Pre-shooting will save half a second of images from before you hit the shutter button. So while I'm half pressing the shutter button, you can see the bar on the left-hand side of the frame there is slightly building or not building, and that's the buffer. Now as soon as I hit the shutter button, it's going to slowly fill up that buffer. So I'm holding the shutter button down now. And once it's full, it's then going to write all of that to the memory card. What it's doing at that point is it will have saved half a second of images preceding me hit the shutter button. So while I'm half pressing, it's basically spooling images. And it's only when you hit the shutter button that it saves the previous half a second. Now this is brilliant for birds in flight, or birds leaving a perch, that sort of thing. Sprinters going off the mark. It's very hard to react quick enough for those sort of situations. And in this case, what you can do is not react quick enough and go back in time and find those images. It's a really great way of essentially getting away with it, of missing the moment. Focus bracketing below. This is for mostly macro work, but it can also be used for landscape things and product photography, for example. What you're doing is allowing the camera to take multiple images, in this case 100 photos, and it'll focus at a certain distance and then focus a bit further and focus a bit further and focus a bit further, taking a photo each time. And it will combine those images in camera if you want. So right down the bottom is depth composite. So you'll actually composite those images in camera. I tend to do it afterwards on the computer. The reason being, you can often go a bit further than you wanted to. So if I'm doing macro things and I'm doing an insect, I don't really want the background to be in focus all the time. So I start with the tips of the antenna, run the exposure bracketing, and it goes through the body of the insect, and then will inevitably kind of go past that and go to the background. If you do it in post-production afterwards, you're able to select how much of that depth you want in focus. So I think it gives you a little bit more flexibility. You can set your focus increment, so how big a distance between each shot, and for the most part, this kind of requires a bit of trial and error depending on the types of subject that you focus on, you photograph, and finding what works for you. The next one, red menu 7. Drive mode. I'm going to bring that back to single shooting. We've already gone through that on the key menu. We have an interval timer, so we can set up the camera to take a picture at every 10 seconds for 10 shots, or many more shots. And as long as you've got power, it will continue to take pictures. Great for doing time lapses of the full resolution of the sensor. We have time-lapse video mode, so we can actually do that in there as well. Bulb timer, we have to be in B for that. But if I enable that, we can set up an exposure time. So info, I can set up a 14-minute and 1 second exposure, for example. You can set up exposures of many hours as well, if you wanted to. Silent shutter function doesn't work when we've got anti-flicker shoot on, so let me just turn that off. Turn that off and come back to that. So silent shutter function. This obviously uses the electronic shutter, so it's completely silent, but it will also mute the beeping and things as well. In the shutter mode, here we have mechanical, electronic, first gun, and electronic. If we put it in electronic, it's essentially the same as the silent shutter mode, but it will make a sound for you. Let me show you. That way you know it's taking a picture. If you don't have that on, if you have it fully silent, and even when you do have that on, it basically makes a white box around the image every time it takes a picture, so you know it's taking a picture. You get some visual confirmation. put that back to manual. The difference between mechanical and electronic, so mechanical, electronic first curtain and electronic shutter mode has some limitations. So it allows the camera to go much faster. You can shoot 40 frames per second rather than it's 20 on this one, mechanical, I think. But with the mechanical, or maybe it's 12, I'm not sure. The mechanical shutter does work with flash, and so does electronic first curtain. The electronic shutter in this doesn't work with flash. It also means that in artificial lighting situations you can get some banding sometimes, and that's where high frequency anti-flicker shoot will be useful for you. But the other area where it's useful, where it has a bit of a limitation, is with subjects that are moving across the frame very fast. You can get rolling shutter with electronic shutter. With mechanical and electronic first curtain you shouldn't get too much of the, well, in mechanical you won't get the rolling shutter, but in the electronic, fully electronic shutter, it does read much quicker than the previous generation, so it's reading 2 lines at a time rather than 1, so you are getting a less rolling shutter than sort of previous models, but it's still a possibility with very fast moving subjects. The last setting on this menu is release shutter without card. I generally recommend having this off. It means the camera cannot take a picture unless you have a memory card in. It's very easy, even though it says no memory card in camera at the top of the screen, it's surprisingly easy to ignore that and take some pictures and realise you're not storing them anywhere. So well worth having that on disable. IS mode, so image stabilizer mode, we can go in here and set up the digital IS for video, so we can turn that on or off, or we can set up the IS mode, whether it's on or off, on the sensor. If the lens doesn't have an image stabilizer switch, this is where you can turn the IS on or off. If it's got a switch on the lens, which this one does, the switch on the lens controls the IS in the body and in the lens. So it's greyed out on this one. Customise quick controls. We can actually, the Q menu that I mentioned, the quick control menu, we can change the layout of that, so we can actually customise what settings are quickly accessible. I'm not going to go into that because what you set yours up to may be very different to how I would want mine. Touch shutter, if we enable or disable that, when we're looking at the image on the back screen, you know, in live view effectively, we can tap the screen to focus on something. If you have touch shutter enabled, it will focus on it and then take a picture as well. I tend to have this off because I often find I leave my camera on when I'm walking around and I'm brushing it up against my arms when it's around a strap, and it takes pictures. But it is very useful if you're really high up and you're looking down over a crowd or something. You want to just tap on something and it will take a picture. There is a little shortcut button on the live view screen, usually. Ah, well, it would be if it was on the back screen. Because I'm on a HDMI, it won't show me that. So below that, image review. The review duration, so this is when you take a picture and it shows you on the back screen how long it holds that image for, and whether it shows you that image in the viewfinder. I have that on disable because every time you're sort of waiting for a subject, you take a few pictures and you let go of the shutter button, it's going to show you the image and then, you know, obscure your view of the subject. So if you have it on disable on the viewfinder, it'll only show you the image when you bring it away from your eye and you look at the back screen. So high-speed display, this will only show for you if you're in the high-speed continuous drive mode. That's, you know, multiple pictures in a row, but not in the very fastest setting. And this will speed up the speed of the display, so it's running at a higher frame rate to keep up with faster subjects. Below that is the metering timer. So this is when you start the metering on half pressing the shutter button, how long it maintains doing that before it sort of idles. Menu 9, display simulation. So this is how the camera behaves regarding your exposure. So as you change your exposure, does it show you that in the viewfinder or on the screen? And that's a great advantage to mirrorless to me, is that what you see is what you get. So as you change the exposure, that's what you get. You can have it off, or just the exposure, or exposure and depth of field. or you can have it totally off. And turning it totally off can be useful for when you're working with flash and the camera doesn't recognize that flash. If you're not using a Canon flash, you might need to disable it in this menu. OVF Simulation View Assist. So if you do this, what you see isn't what you get, but it makes the viewfinder look a little bit more natural and look more like a digital SLR. So if you want it to look more how you're used to from a DSLR, this is the best way of doing it. It increases the dynamic range and makes the colours look more natural. Below that, shooting info display, so the information that's shown in the viewfinder or on the back screen, and you can toggle information on or off. I tend to enable like a 6x4 grid on here to help with composition. That's my kind of go-to thing. Histogram you can change from a brightness or RGB histogram, so instead of it just being a single thing, it's 3 histograms with individual RGB channels. And you can also enable the lens information display, so the distance of focus. So if you're doing sort of macro stuff or mostly macro stuff, this is beneficial. Below that, viewfinder display format. This sort of crops in slightly. I don't really know why, but it's always been on our cameras and it's useful for someone. I just haven't known anyone to do it. Display performance. So this is in the for keeping up with fast-moving subjects. Power saving basically reduces the frame rate. I tend to have it on smooth because I like to have the camera keeping up in the viewfinder for fast-moving subjects. Next menu, movie record size. So this is, I think, to do with the record button when you're not in video mode. So we can set here the record size. We've got 4K in 50 frames per second, which is sort of twice the speed you need, so you can actually go slow-mo, to half speed in 4K, or full HD in 50 or 25p. Sound recording, we can set up the audio to automatically adjust the levels, so how loud or quiet it is. If you're doing an interview or doing a situation like this, automatic can be a little bit problematic because every time I have it go quiet, it's trying to look for some audio and it raises those levels, and you start to kind of introduce noise, then just the background noise in between bits. So it can be worth having that on manual and then monitoring your levels yourself. For ad hoc clips, for the most part, I leave it on automatic. ISO speed settings, we can adjust the highest ISO for the automatic in video. This is on the video side. It was similar settings to what we showed you earlier. Auto slow shutters. So this is how slow the shutter speed can go in video and it's dark, whether you want it to be smooth motion or you just want more a slightly brighter image. And you can adjust what the shutter button does when you're in video mode, when you're recording a video. All right, AF menu 1. Now the AF menu is an area that I think if you're coming from a digital SLR to these cameras is where a lot of the learning happens, because it is fundamentally very different to how a digital SLR works. Everything else pretty much works in a very similar way. So AF operation, Servo, AI focus and one shot, we've gone through that already. Servo is to keep up with while you're half pressing the button, it's continually focusing. So if you're photographing moving subjects, you want it to be in servo. One shot is it focuses, locks, and then you can take a picture. AI focus is a hybrid. AF area. This is new. So we can set a specific different AF area for the orientation of the camera. This is a new thing on this camera. I hadn't seen this before. So you can actually, when the camera is in this way, you can set up a different grouping to other areas, which is quite useful. Whole area tracking Servo AF. So this is whether it's actually tracking the subject once you start focus, and it will only do that if you're in Servo. Subject detect vehicles or people or auto. As I mentioned earlier, having it on auto will enable it to find the subject no matter what it is. However, it will find that subject quicker if you know that you're focusing on an animal to set it to animal. So set it to animal and it will pick it out from a longer, from further away and a bit quicker. I'm going to set that to people because it is what I generally photograph. Eye detection, you can automatically pick the eye and it will normally go for, by default, kind of go for the eye that's closer to the camera. So if I'm like this, it'll go for my left eye. But if you have a preference for eyes, which eye it focuses on, then you can determine that there. Or just disable eye detection entirely. It will still pick out the face, but it will just won't put a box around the eye. So switching track subjects. Now if you are picking out your bride, if you're a wedding photographer, or you're picking out a particular bird, how quickly does the camera decide that it can't find the eye on that person or that bird? It's going to go to the one that's facing the camera. So it'll switch between different subjects if there's multiple in the scene. If you have it on high, it's going to switch very easily. If you have it on low, it's going to try and stick to just that first subject. So it's really a useful setting here because particularly for wedding photographers, you want it to pick the bride and you want it to stay on the bride on the dance floor. Having it on a lower one is very useful. Now, AF menu 2, this is the cases. So this is how the focusing system behaves once you're already tracking something. So you're half pressing, you've got it on servo and it's tracking that subject moving across the frame. It's not about the initial pickup. It's not about that first find the focusing. This is not going to affect that in any way. So if you're doing things that aren't moving and you're very stationary, you can entirely ignore this menu. It's not going to make a difference. Where it will make a difference is if your subject is moving, it's how that movement or how that subject behaves. You're setting up the camera to sort of be ready for that. You can set it to auto and it will do a pretty good job, but if you know your subject's coming directly towards you, you would want to have it differently to if it's moving across. So if you're doing motorsports and your subject's kind of going across the frame regularly and predictably, and you're panning with it, then you'd probably want tracking sensitivity to be on lower. So the two variables this is affecting, you'll notice that the arrows on the right hand side are affecting tracking sensitivity or acceleration, deceleration tracking. So tracking sensitivity is basically as I'm moving the camera across the frame and I'm tracing a subject, if that subject went behind a branch or a lamppost and then came out the other side, if the tracking sensitivity is on very high, it is going to focus on that lamppost and then try and go back to the thing afterwards. So anything that changes the distance it's going to react to. If it's on slightly lower, it will notice the change in distance, ignore it for a second, think, oh, that's probably an obstacle, and then when it comes out the other side, it's still at the same distance and it continues focusing a lot easier. If your subject is coming directly towards you, that is a constant change of distance, so you want your tracking sensitivity to be on quite high. Something like case 3. You can actually go in and say rate, you can press the rate button and customize these so you can have it on even more responsive. When I'm doing birds in flight and they're coming directly towards me and you know they're coming directly towards me, I have this on the highest possible setting. Because that's a difficult thing for the camera to focus on and you don't want to add any time delay to it. Generally speaking, I recommend finding one that works for you as they are and not customize them. And when you get used to the differences in behavior, then customize them from there. Acceleration, deceleration tracking is about the subject sort of starting moving or stopping in the frame. So sprinters, for example, off the 100-meter line, that sort of thing, or a bird taking off from a perch. Having this on slightly higher will prepare the camera for that kind of behavior. I don't notice the difference so much on the acceleration, deceleration tracking, but I definitely notice it on the tracking sensitivity. So it's worth having a play with that. Okay, AF menu 3, one shot AF release priority. So when you're in one shot, does it prioritize taking a picture that's in focus or taking a picture? What's the point in taking a picture that isn't in focus is my philosophy on this, so I tend to have it on focus. Preview AF, this used to be called continuous AF, so if you had gone from a previous camera to this, just be aware of that. So preview AF is basically when the camera's idling, is it focusing? If it's preview AF is on, when it's idling and you're just not doing anything, it's kind of hunting for something to focus on. So you're roughly, the idea is that you're roughly in the right place when you pick up the camera and start focusing. I find this quite annoying because if you're focusing and you've sort of pre-focused on a perch for a bird, it'll then just kind of get bored and wait and try and find something else to focus on. I have this off, and then it stays where I leave it, and then I can take a picture when I'm ready. Lens drive when AF is impossible. But whether it continues to try focusing when it can't find anything to focus on. AF assist beam firing, so there's a little assist beam here which basically illuminates your subject to help the AF when it's very, very, very dark. Bearing in mind these cameras can focus at -6.5 EV, which is really, really dark. It would take the human eye a minute and a half to adjust to -6 EV, so if it went dark now, I wouldn't be able to see. This would be able to continue focusing. Was that the last one? Yeah. So AF menu 4, touch and drag AF settings. If you don't want to use the joystick, you can actually use the touchscreen as a joystick. So you can have the camera up to your eye and use your thumb across the touchscreen to drag the focusing point across the screen. And you can set that to where in the screen you would use it. I really recommend using it on relative, not absolute, because at absolute, it's where the focusing point is where your thumb is, which is slightly harder to control. Oops. Limit AF areas, so if you don't use any of these, you can limit how many you have to cycle through when you're changing them. AF area selection control, so you can press the top right button here and then cycle through using the manual function button or the dial, entirely up to you. Sensitivity of AF point selection, so on this control dial, how sensitive that is, how quickly it moves across the screen. Orientation linked AF point. So as I mentioned earlier, you can change the kind of grouping for when you're in different positions, when you're in portrait or landscape, but you can actually change where that point is in the screen. So if you in portrait, you know it's going to be up here, so you can set it to that. And when you're in landscape, you need it somewhere in the middle, you can set it to that. And then when you switch between the two, it's already in the right place, or roughly. Limit subject to detect, so you can reduce, if you never photograph animals, you can remove that. And left right eye detection, you can reduce the ones in the selection there as well. Right, the next one is AF menu 5. In here we have manual focus peaking settings. Now, it won't show me this because I'm connected up to the HDMI and it doesn't want to show me the manual focus peaking outline. But when you're in focus, roughly in focus, it starts to give you a glowy outline of what's in focus on the screen. And you can set this up to be red or other colours depending on what subject you're photographing and what would be more visible. Now, focus peaking is pretty accurate. What is more accurate is the focus guide. So if I set the focus guide to on, I can show you this. It uses the dual pixel AF system to show you whether you're front or back focusing, and then it will turn green when you're in focus. This is a brilliant system, and it's more accurate than focus peaking. With focus peaking, often you have to sort of check, get you in focus, magnify in using the magnify button, and then check that you're in focus. And it's a little bit clunkier. With this, you can move the focus point to where you want, and it will find focus and tell you if you're front or back focusing. It's a really, really great system. And that box can actually track a face as well if you wanted it to. Let me turn that off. Movie servo AF, so whether the camera is continually focusing in movie mode, so that way you can track moving subjects. You can just tap a person and it will track that person. AF menu 6, electronic full-time manual focus. So this allows the camera to override your autofocus at any point to manual, and you can just move the focusing ring. Below that is electronic manual focusing, how the manual focusing behaves if you have an electronic focusing, electronic manual focus. So this is sort of fly-by-wire. When I move this, it isn't physically moving anything, it's just digitally telling the lens to change focus. And in this mode, you can sort of set up how the focusing behaves. So when you're in one shot, once it's focused, does it enable or disable the manual focus ring? Focus ring rotation, because you're on a electronic focusing lens, it can go in either direction, so you can reverse the direction for focus. And how sensitive it is as well. So this is a really cool thing about the RF lenses, is because it's all fly-by-wire, you can adjust the throw. So if you want it to adjust the focus with one small turn, it can do that, or if you want it to be much more accurate and you have to turn it quite a lot for a small change in focus, you can also do that. Okay, next one. Playback menu, we have the option to protect certain images. We can go and select a range of images if you like, and that adds a lock symbol to them and it won't delete those images. You can go erase images, so you can arrange a whole burst of images or a whole date or a whole folder or single images. You can rotate images in the camera as well here, so if it was shot in portrait and it didn't register that, you can do that. And you can actually set the rotation info of a video, so if you haven't set that up in the video menu, which I will show you, you can rotate the information. So if you're doing a portrait video, it doesn't automatically recognize that. You can set ratings, so what rating, you know, a star rating for the images, and if you don't use all of the stars and you only use 1 star and 5 star, you can reduce those as well. And you can copy images from one card to another, which is very useful. Playback menu 2, you can set up and order prints directly from the camera using a web service. I mean, I don't know anyone that really uses this, to be honest. You can connect it up to a, download the images and get more control over your prints and photo books that way. So that's how I tend to do it. RAW processing, you can process your RAWs down to a JPEG if you need to use just the JPEG quite quickly. Creative Assist, you can go in here and add different settings to your images. So we can add choose a different preset or brightness and just effectively edit the image slightly in camera here. Quick control RAW processing, this is what's on the cue screen when you're going through the menu. So when you're playing back images, what's on the cue screen. The same when we press the Q button, it brings up a menu on either side, similar to when we're doing the images. Dual pixel RAW processing, so you can, if you shot in dual pixel RAW, it's able to determine what the background is from your subject and then increase the contrast just in the background. It can also relight a portrait, so it can pick out the face and kind of increase the brightness in the face alone if it needs to. Cloud RAW image processing, if you are subscribed to a cloud system that basically exports images to the cloud and will do even better image processing for you. Playback creative filters, you can actually set the creative filters that I mentioned earlier, like the fisheye things, all in here as well. So you can do it afterwards. Playback menu 4, we can resize images. If you know you're going to need to kind of send a small JPEG quite quickly, you can do that here. You can also crop images in camera, and you can convert from HEIF back to JPEG should you need some to do that for compatibility reasons. Playback 5, you can start a slideshow, so if you're connected up via HDMI to a screen, you can do that. You can search for images on the memory card. You can set whether when you press play, it shows you the last image you looked at. So if you kind of cycle through images and it timed out and you press play again, it will not go back to the most recent image. It just shows you the last one you looked at. I prefer it like this. And the last one, magnification. So this is the little top tip I mentioned earlier. The magnify button, when you go into playback, automatically jumps into 2x magnification and that isn't that useful. If you're checking focus, you need to sort of zoom into actual size, like 100%. So you can set 100% from focus point rather than the middle, and it will zoom in as soon as you press, in fact I'll do it now. So we can play back, press magnify, and it will zoom into the focus where I focused and at 100% zoom. Obviously I was shooting in bulb mode at that point, so it's a terrible load of shutter speed. But it's very easy for me to check autofocus, check the focus was correct there. Playback menu 6, we can set the image jump with the front wheel. This is generally set to 10 images on the front wheel. And then on different wheels as well, so we can switch front and back control wheels if we wanted to. and we can set the rate button function. So what the rate button actually applies to an image. We can either set it to protect images, we can set it to delete images if we wanted to, and we can set it to browse images and jump across multiple things depending on what you set it to. Playback menu 7. How much information is shown? So you've got 11 different screens to cycle through if you tap the info button. I would generally remove some of that. Highlight alert, alert. So what it will do is if anything's coming up to 90% and close to clipping or has clipped, it will actually blink. It will kind of flash black and white on the screen. It will show the AF point display if you enable that as well, so where it was trying to focus. It'll give you a grid overlay on your images, and if you set up that as well, which can help with composition and ensuring that you were composed correctly. Movie playback count, or movie play count, it will show you the time code or recording time. If your time code's useful if you're working with multiple cameras and they're all synchronized. HDMI, HDR output, so if you're playing back images to a HDR screen to get the best out of it, you would enable this here as well. All right, connection menu. So number 1, we are able to connect to EOS Utility, smartphones, so wireless remote, Bluetooth remote, all of that is in this menu. Smartphone, you're able to control the camera remotely. You can update the camera's firmware remotely using the Canon Camera Connect app. It's a really great piece of kit. Wireless remote is a Bluetooth thing. Again, really simple to set up. And also with a smartphone, it can be paired over Bluetooth. So the Bluetooth is an always-on connection, but once you sort of enable it in the app, it will turn the camera on and allow you to look at the images on the camera. And also you can actually view what the camera is seeing and remotely take a picture and view what it's watching. Connect to EOS Utility, so this is if you're doing it to a laptop or a computer on location and you're shooting tethered, EOS Utility will enable you to do that. And you can actually, if you're subscribed, I think there is a free, a limited amount of free data on this, but if you're subscribed to image.canon, you can upload your images via your phone's 5G connection directly to image.canon, so you can have a backup. The next page is for FTP transfer, which is a little bit more complicated. I'm not going to go into it in massive detail, but this is file transfer protocol. Now, if you're a press photographer or a sports photographer and you needed to send images to someone on an image desk or an editor, this also works in the studio. If you don't want to shoot tethered in the same way that it's just showing you an image every time, but it's just populating a folder, you can set it to an FTP send it to an FTP server, which you would set up in your studio or on that picture editor's desk, and you type in the IP address of that computer, type in the password and stuff, and it will either send every image you take or send images that you determine that you want to send by pressing the set button, and that's in the settings in this as well. So the final bit on this is airplane mode. This disables all Wi-Fi and any signature of electromagnetic radiation signatures. Wi-Fi settings here, we can go in and determine things in more detail if you needed to. Most people don't need to go in here. We can set the camera name so it's easier for you to identify, particularly if you have multiple of them. So in here you can set up the GPS receiver or a smartphone. So if you don't have the receiver, you can actually use your smartphone's GPS information and it will transfer that to and embed that into the metadata of your images. Error details, if you get an error, particularly with FTP, the initial setup of an FTP server can be a little bit fiddly, and it will give you details of what's gone wrong in this bit. And you can fully reset your communication settings there as well. Because if you don't know what you've done wrong and things aren't quite working, just reset it and start again and it'll probably work fine. Right, yellow menu. Yellow menu 1, record function card folder select. So similar to what I showed you on one of the cue screens earlier, we are able to set up record functions for different cards separately. So we can do video and stills on different cards. We can set up the thing to sort of fill out one card and start on the other, anything like that. And we can also go in here and set up a new folder. I actually have on mine the set button is customized to make a new folder, and I find this really useful because, you know, through the day, or if I don't change a card for a week or whatever, I can set up a different folder for different shoots. I also don't recommend leaving one card for multiple shoots over a week. You should back up more than that. File numbering, continuous, or it resets to 1 every single time. I leave it on continuous because you can change cards through a shoot and it will go back to 1, and then you end up with clashes because they both got the same file number. File name, we can set up the prefix on the file name, so we can set up you know, you can have it actually set to a shoot. So my partner does stuff like it will be the name of the venue that she's shooting on, so she knows that those images came from that place. We can format the card here. We can auto-rotate the images, so it gives you the data of whether you're in portrait or landscape, whether it shows you that rotation on the camera or just on the computer. I often actually set this to just on the computer. That way, on the back screen, it will show you the full image when you're in portrait, rather than going to sort of landscape, showing a portrait image on a landscape screen, which doesn't show quite as large. So video rotation info, this is the setting you need for if you do portrait videos for social media and that sort of thing. Enable that here. And you can set the date and time on this as well. If you connect it up to your phone, it will actually, you can sync the time via there as well on the app. Language, if you need to change the language, you have a lot of choice. Video system, PAL or NTSC. We work in PAL in Europe. The US works in NTSC. It doesn't matter too much anymore because a lot of content is viewed on the internet, so it doesn't make any difference really. But it's just something to note. Help text size. If you need it slightly larger so you can read it easier, you can do that here. We can, when you're switching between modes, does it tell you any information about that mode? We can enable that there, and feature guide. So when you're kind of going through the menu and it shows you something, or on the cue screen, it will give you a little bit of information about what that setting does. Which you won't need because you've watched this video. Beep. I disable this because I don't like my thing beeping at me. But basically what this does is when you confirm focus, it will bleep for you. You can set up your volume on your headphones. You can set up power saving settings here, and this is not how it is by default because I've had to disable the automatic power off and things. It's generally, you don't need to change this too much, but if you find that you need the camera just running and not turning itself off, you can do that in this bit of the menu. Spanner menu 4, screen or viewfinder display. So this is about it switching between the viewfinder or the back screen. By default now, when you have the screen out, it will not go to the viewfinder. So if you think the viewfinder is suddenly not working, it's probably because your screen is slightly out. When your screen's, the reason for that is if your screen's out, it's expecting you to use the screen, and if you're using the screen down here, it can be your sort of chest or your hair or whatever can trigger that proximity sensor, and it will turn off the screen and switch to the viewfinder. So if you want it to switch all the time, even when the screen's out, you can have an auto 2, or you can manually set viewfinder or screen only. You can actually set up a custom button if you wanted to switch between the two as well. I'm going to leave that on that one. You can set the brightness of the screen and the brightness of the viewfinder separately in here, and you can change the viewfinder or screen color tone if you find that it's not quite looking correct to your eye. You can fine-tune the viewfinder color tone as well to have a look through. User interface magnification. So I had this question recently actually. So this is about if you can't see things on the screen properly, things are too small, menu items are too small. If you enable this, you can tap the screen with 2 fingers and it will effectively magnify into anything you're looking at. It won't show me that now because I'm connected via HDMI, so it's not even showing me on this screen. So, but that's a useful setting if you can't quite see anything. HDMI resolution, whether you're forcing it to use 1080p or just leave it on automatic. I tend to leave it on auto. Touch control. If you have fingers that are less reactive to touch panels, or you're wearing gloves, you can increase the sensitivity of the touch panel, or you can entirely disable it if that is your preference. The multifunction lock, that's that switch between on and off up on the top of the camera. This is where you customize what that locks, so you can turn off the touchscreen with it if you wanted to. I find that now that's the most common use of it, is to turn off the touchscreen, because sometimes you just want to stop it from, stop any chance of you just accidentally tapping the focus or something. Shutter at shutdown. So when you turn the camera off, the camera brings the shutter down over the sensor to protect the sensor, which is really useful when you're changing lenses. You want it to protect the sensor. You can take the lens off and there's no chance of dust getting on there. Sensor cleaning, every time you turn the camera off, it kind of goes into an ultrasonic sensor clean, or you can manually start it, and you can choose your USB connection app. So you can set the USB-C cable to your computer to do different things. So you can have it go to import images or control the camera over EOS Utility. You can set it up to be a webcam. It's a plug-and-play webcam as well. Or you can choose Canon apps on the iPhone, because this is it MFI certified is the term, which is an iPhone certification for using it with iPhone apps. So we can, yellow menu 6, we can go in here and reset the camera. In the past, this would be a lot of different areas you'd have to find. The reset all settings button actually didn't reset very much, so you'd have to go and find all of these different settings individually to find them. They've now grouped into one place, which is rather useful. Custom shooting modes here. On reset camera, if there is a setting you can't figure out what you've changed and something's not quite working right, just go and reset it. You're not going to break anything. You can just reset an area, a different area of the camera that you think that part is from, and then it'll probably fix it. Custom shooting mode, C1 to 3. When you've set the camera up the way you want it and you want to save the custom shooting mode, you can go in here and register the settings. Down the bottom is auto update set. I actually enable this. This will depend on how you like to work. When you've changed, you've gone to custom 3, you've set it up, and you've gone to custom 3, you use it. It might not be exactly the right settings for the situation, so you're going to just tweak it a little bit. When you turn the camera off and turn it back on, it'll reset back to what you originally set custom 3 up to. Or if you have it on enable with auto update set, it'll update it every time you change anything on custom 3. I think that's my preferred way of doing it. Battery information, it'll give you an idea of how well your battery is performing. This is an old battery of mine, and its performance is pretty poor now. It's a very, very old battery. Copyright information, you can embed this in the metadata of the images. You can enter your name and it'll set it into the metadata of your images, give you a little bit of protection. Manual and software URL, this is just to give you a quick QR code to find the manual. And this is just something we have to have in the certification stuff. So firmware, if you need to update your firmware or your lens firmware, you can find that in here. You just need to download it off the website, put it on a memory card and stick it in the camera. Go to this menu and it will give you an option to update. Or you can use the Camera Connect app and it will all do it over Wi-Fi. And it's really slick, actually. It's a pretty good way of doing it. I did that way last time. Right. The orange menu, so this is the sort of customizing stuff a little bit more for the way you like to work. So you can set the increments for your exposure level, whether it's in third stops, full stops, or just half stops. So third stops or half stops. Okay, the next one is speed from metering, ISO, auto. So when you're automatic ISO and the rest of the camera is doing whatever it's doing, and you start the metering, at the end of the metering, does it return to auto or does it stick to that ISO? Can't imagine a situation where you want to change this. Correct me if I'm wrong. Bracketing auto cancel, I mean, someone must want it because it's there. Bracketing auto cancel. So if you're in the auto exposure bracketing thing, you've got one lower, one higher, and one in the middle. Whether it cancels that after one set of those or not. Bracketing sequence, the order in which it does those 3 or 5 or 7 images. The number of bracketed shots, you can set how many of those are in the bracket. Safety shift is basically allows the camera to automatically override your exposure a little bit if it thinks it's way too under or way too high. So to ensure that you're not clipping the image. Right, exposure for new aperture. This is more about when you change lens. So if you go from a 2.8 lens to an f4, it'll adjust the other settings for you, so you're getting your starting point is the same exposure as it was. The next one is auto exposure lock metering mode after focus. So when you half press the shutter button, which of the metering modes locks the exposure once you've half pressed, once it's focused. Set shutter speed range. You can adjust this from mechanical and electronic. One thing I haven't really mentioned, because it's more of a spec thing than a menu thing, but in electronic shutter mode you can go faster than 0.008 of a second, which has long been a sort of the fastest shutter speed you'll get out of a digital SLR or a mechanical shutter. You can now go to 0.016 of a second, which is blazingly fast. Set aperture range. If you want to limit your aperture range, you can do that here. I tend to limit my shutter speed range because I have a habit of going too slow for sometimes. So if I'm in a low light environment, I will force the camera to not let me go slower than 200th of a second or 400th of a second or something like that. Custom 3 menu. So we can change the direction of the dial. So you can change whether turning it left turns it down or turns it up. You can also do the same with the control ring on the lens, and you can change the function of the front ring and the back ring when you're in shooting. So if you want one to be the ISO, one to be shutter speed, you want to switch it around or whatever, you can do that. You can customize buttons here. As we've already gone through that a little bit when we were going through the Q menu. So if you want to go through some of the customized buttons bit, have a look at the Q menu part of this video. Customized dials, we can go in here and change what each of these dials does individually. When you see a little down arrow next to it, so here we have, we want to change exposure compensation, but it'll only do it when we're holding the metering button, so if we're half pressing the shutter button. That just means that you're not going to knock it when you're not using it, you know. You have to hold another button down and turn the lens ring. And you can clear all of these settings on the Clear Customize Settings button. Number 4, add cropping information. So we can set a aspect ratio, and it will add that information to the image to give you an idea for afterwards. We can set up the audio compression, whether we want it to be all of the data or not. Default erase option is either delete the selected image or just select the JPEG and not the RAW, or vice versa. Release shutter without lens. Now sometimes if you're using an adapted lens with an old, an older kind of lens that isn't necessarily got a chip in it and the camera doesn't recognize it, it's going to think there isn't a lens there, and it won't take a picture. So you will have to find this setting in the camera, release shutter without lens, and turn that on, and it will then take a picture and hope that there is a lens there. Retract lens when power off. If you have a lens that has a focusing motor that moves the front element of the lens back and forwards, when you turn the camera off, it will bring that back. The only reason to turn this off is if you are working on a sort of stationary situation. Where I found this useful was when I was doing stop motion work. I've set the camera up to set to a focus area. I don't want it to move from that point at any time. If I need to change the battery or anything, I don't want it to change. So I turn this off so that it doesn't bring the focusing back in, because otherwise I'd have to set it up again when I turn it back on. Add IPTC information, so we can add information to the metadata of the image, and this can be very detailed about the shoot location and all sorts, even contact details of the people that are in the shoot, the companies, everything. You set this up on your computer or on the, I think in Camera Connect app or one of the apps, but you can store multiple on your computer and then send them over to the camera. And I think the camera can store multiple versions of IPTC data, and you can pick between them if you have some registered. And you can clear all custom functions on this button here. The last one here is the My Menu tab. If you have a few things from anywhere in this menu system that you use, but you've struggled to find them quickly, which is understandable, there's a lot in here, you can set up a My Menu tab. So we can set up a My Menu here, we can name it Landscape, and I pick a few settings in the menu that I use for landscape a lot, like HDR or anything like that, and I can set those to here. I can then also tell the menu to show from My Menu tab. So when I go back to here, every time I press menu, it's going to start in the green area. It's going to start from this bit, rather than start from anywhere else. So I can very quickly get to settings that I use regularly. I'm going to put that back to normal now. Now, that's everything. I'm going to switch to video mode and go back through it a little bit as well, because in video mode you get a few different settings. So I'm going to show you the menu here. We immediately have a slightly different first menu. So we can go in movie record size. You'll notice there's more options for movie record size here. We have the option of doing IPB or IPB Lite. So IPB is already a compressed image format in video, and IPB Lite is an even more compressed video format. If you're doing less editing, then you could probably go to a light format. You just want the clip to be as small on your memory card as possible. If you want a little bit more image quality and a little bit more flexibility for editing, having IPB would be better. So we've got 4K, we've got Full HD, and we've got some slightly different sizes on that. So we've got 50p or 25p. High frame rate mode, this puts it into 100 frames per second, and doesn't record the audio, just so you know, but it will actually do super slow-mo video for you. Okay, so movie cropping, we can do that even in 4K, so it'll actually just crop in slightly and still use the full 4K resolution. If you're in 1080p 25 frames a second, you can actually use digital zoom as well, so it'll again crop into the sensor essentially and still use the full 1080p, so you're getting a little bit more flexibility out of your lenses. Below that is sound recording. Again, we can pick out our levels for the audio, and if you're doing something a little bit more involved, you might want to set this to manual and set it yourself. Right, the next one we have is HDR shooting, HDR PQ. This is the HDR PQ standard, so this is a higher dynamic range shooting. HDR movie recording actually is even more high dynamic range, and it isn't the sort of standardized way of doing it, and it basically takes 2 frames very quickly and combines them. Auto lighting optimizer, similar to in video. In stills, we're letting the camera prioritize the light on the face of your subject, and we can still do the high frequency anti-flicker shooting and the highlight tone priority that we had in the stills mode. We can actually set up aperture increments of much smaller than 1/3, so we can go to 1/8 stop increments. We get smoother change in exposure when changing the aperture if you wanted to on video mode. That only works with certain lenses, so it'll only be on the RF lenses. Other things that are different in here, so we can set up Canon log. So log is a way of increasing dynamic range again. So what you're getting with log, if I turn that on, see log 3, and turn off view assist, what you'll see is a very grey image. And that grey image is increasing the dynamic range. So, it doesn't clip the highlights, it kind of brings those highlights down. It looks a bit flat, and you would color grade it afterwards to make it look more appropriate for actually viewing it. But it gives you the most possible dynamic range of... and And it also means when you're working across multiple cameras, you can sort of unify the look of those cameras. View Assist basically shows me what it would look like after color grading, essentially, but it records it in that grey look in log. Just makes it easier on the eye and easier for me to see what it will look like afterwards if it's got the View Assist on. All right, next bit. Oh yeah, so we can do a pre-recording and video. Similar to what we've got in the raw burst mode, we can go back in time and save half a second. In video, you can save 5 seconds before you hit the record button. So it's constantly spooling 5 seconds, and you don't have to be half pressing anything for this. And as soon as you hit the record button, it will go back and save the last 5 seconds. A little bit like a dash cam, but similar kind of concept. We can go in and set up the time-lapse movie. I can't do that because I'm connected to the HDMI here, but the time-lapse video basically allows me to, it will take a picture or a frame of video every 5 seconds for 2 days if I wanted it to, as long as you've got the power and the memory to do that. And it will then compile all of that into one lovely time-lapse. So if you're doing a time-lapse of a sunset or something, it's lovely. Movie self-timer, this is really useful. I use this in this situation where I'm sort of going back and forth to start the camera recording for this sort of thing, because it cuts out that bit of walking to and from the camera. To start the video. Anything else? You can set the shutter button function for the videos here. You can set up your digital IS for video, and you can actually set up on or enhance. And what it's doing is cropping in digitally to your image a little bit, but it uses that crop to move the image around on the sensor to give you image stabilisation. False color you can set up for to give you an idea of where your exposure is. It gives you a very clear idea of what parts of your images are close to overexposing. Similar with zebra, you can set up the tolerances, so the pattern of the zebra at different levels of exposure. And I think that is, and these ones are the last ones for the video settings that are different. Quick control screen, you can customize that, and you can set up the time code here as well. So if you're working with multiple cameras, it doesn't have a time code port. I think it does this over either USB or over Wi-Fi. I've never done it though, so I'm not totally clear on that one. The other things that changed in the video mode is the AF things a little bit. So you've got Movie Servo AF. You can adjust the speed of the servo, and I find this very useful to go and adjust for different things. So sometimes I want this to be on quite slow, because then I can tap on an area here and then tap on an area there, and you get this really lovely slow pull focus from one area of an image to the next. If you have it on quite fast, it can be quite jarring. You know, it works great for stills, but actually in video you sometimes want it a bit smoother and slower. And you can adjust the tracking sensitivity. So if your subject's kind of coming to the camera directly, in the same way we have the cases, we just have the tracking sensitivity on this one, so we can increase or decrease the tracking sensitivity here, depending on how the subject's behaving. That is, I think, all that's different in the video mode. Okay, that is everything in an EOS R6 Mark II. There's a lot to go through on that camera, and there's a lot to remember, but you don't need to remember everything. That's the point of this video. It will be bookmarked for different time parts of the video for different areas of the menu in the description. If you have any questions, or you feel like you didn't need a bit more information about anything individually, either drop me a message on Instagram or YouTube. My Instagram is @rajk.photo, or leave a comment on this video. I will check back, and some of the WEX guys will also have a look, and I'm sure the community will be happy to help too. Thank you very much for watching. I hope that was helpful. I hope you have a lovely day. Goodbye.